Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I welcome you, those who are listening through this live stream. This event is hosted in a cooperation between the Swiss Institute for Foreign Research from the University of Zurich as well as the Frank Schirrmacher Foundation. The Schirrmacher Foundation annually awards the Frank Schirrmacher Award to remember Frank Schirrmacher, who died at the age of 55 in June 2014. He was the co-publisher of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. Frank Schirrmacher was a free spirit, a creative mind, and provocative journalist and human being. In 2022, the Foundation Board awarded the Schirrmacher Award to Dutch and US writer, political scientist, and advocate of women's rights, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. We welcome Ayaan Hirsi Ali amongst us here at the studio for the ceremony. Welcome, Ayaan.
Again, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
At the same time, we will also award the first Peace Prize of the Frank Schirrmacher Foundation. It is awarded to Ukrainian writer, publicist and musician Serhiy Zhadan. Past Wednesday, Serhiy had a memorable keynote at the University of Zurich, and today he is watching and following this event through his live stream, and we hope that that this works. Congratulations, Serhiy Zhadan, on the award of the Freedom Prize that we are happy to award to such a courageous defender of freedom and the values of freedom. I also welcome here in Zurich the writer and defender of women's rights Alice Schwarzer and journalist Alice Prizkau. Alice Schwarzer will be holding the laudation on Ayaan Hirsi Ali before Ayaan will be speaking to us. The laudation for Serhiy Zhadan will be afterwards held by Anna Prizkau. She is a journalist with the Frankfurter Allgemeinen Sonntagszeitung. In the context of this ceremony, I will have the honor to exchange a few words with Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Ladies and gentlemen, never since the end of World War II have global tensions been stronger and more threatening than today. Never has it been as urgent to act and to get out of illusions and habits. Never has it been more urgent to show courage, because today, it's all about the defense of enlightenment. It's about defending Western values that are based on freedom, on self-determination, on human rights, on the dignity and the inviolability of the individual, on the possibilities they have to shape their own lives. And that is why we have come here together. We have come here to honor two personalities who are fearless in their fight against obscurantism, against tyranny, against the power of usurpators, and against the hubris of autocrats. Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Serhiy Zhadan. Thank you very much for your dedication in your fight, and with that I hand over to Alice Schwarzer for the laudation. Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed awardees, Dear Ayaan, Hirsi Ali, this is the second time that I have the honor and the pleasure of giving laudation for you, dear Ayaan. The first time was in 2006, and that's how long we go back, 16 years ago, at the occasion of the Human Rights Award in Kassel, Germany. A year before that, my publication, Emma, had done a cover story with you even twice because we were so awed by your courage in the way you're lifting your head against Islam. We thought what you were doing was great, but already back then you had the reputation of being right-wing, of being a racist even. That slander came from the left and it has not died down since. And the fact that you went to the United States, fleeing the malice, the hatred and death threats in Europe did not make it any better. What was and what is the reason for the hatred towards you? You, the Somali-born Muslim, had dared to criticize not only Islamism, political Islam that takes faith hostage. No, you also dared criticize Islam itself. I have just recently read in a Swiss magazine that indeed you have tackled a second sacred cow of the left, gender feminism and its latest outgrowth, trans ideology. I'll get back to that a bit later. I hope it's in your interest that I will address that as well. Let's follow the traces of your life. When you come from far away, you sometimes take bigger steps. Simone de Beauvoir said that back in 1969, in the year when Ayaan Hirsi Ali was born in Somalia. At that time, Ayaan's homeland is shaken by civil war and corruption. Her father, a politician from the opposition, is in prison and later flees into exile. Her mother is an Orthodox Muslim, and her grandmother, who lives with them, comes, as Ayaan says, from the Iron Age. When asked how many children she had, the grandmother replies, 1. The grandmother had 1 son and 9 daughters. Under these conditions, Ayaan could have become something very different from the woman we honor today for her intellect, courage, and her unbrokenness. Ayaan could have lain dead under the brutal beatings of her mother and her Quran teacher, like so many of her friends. Ayaan could have lost her mind over all the humiliation, genital mutilation, and forced marriage, like her sister. But Ayaan chose a third option. She resisted. Ayaan and her sister had been seduced into the world of thought and dreams by Western literature at school, where both daughters had prevailed over their illiterate mother. There, Enid Blyton and Scarlett O'Hara became her heroines, just as they are our heroines. In her autobiography, Ayaan tells how back in 1992, on the way to meet the unwanted husband, a Somali in Canada, whom her father had chosen for her, she fled at the stopover in Frankfurt. She is granted asylum in the Netherlands and quickly learns that women are human beings too. She takes off her headscarf and now calls herself Hirsi Ali to avoid detection by her vengeful family. And she learns and she learns and learns. She recognizes that there is a life beyond fear, beyond sexual hostility, beyond submission. Europe seems like a paradise to the young African woman, a paradise for women. Ayaan no longer wants to hear her own people's external excuse. We are victims of Western racism. She demands self-criticism. She learns how necessary this is not only as a student of political science, she also learns it when she works as a translator at women's shelters, where she sees that the conditions from their home country are imported into Europe with violent men and disempowered women. But Ayaan Hirsi Ali is no longer silent. She names the extent of violence against women and children, the disenfranchisement through faith, the dependence on the family clan. And she takes on the cultural relativists, these pseudo-progressive Westerners who, in the name of cultural religious difference, dress up their double standards as tolerance. Promptly, Ayaan, the African migrant, is defamed as a racist by these Europeans, which is not without irony. The others should remain the others, so that we remain the ones who make the law. I know what Ayaan Hirsi Ali is talking about. When, after my trip in 1979 to Khomeini's theocracy, I warned about what was brewing there, I too was promptly vilified as a racist in Germany. For decades, Emma, my publication, was a lonely voice in the German-speaking world speaking out against the Islamists' crusades, from Pakistan and Afghanistan to Chechnya to Algeria and Libya, even right in the heart of Europe. It has taken a long time for Europe to wake up. And Germany, which for decades was considered the European hub of Islamic terrorism, is only now slowly waking up. While alarmed by Islamic terror, it still ignores the even more dangerous legalistic Islamism. Germany's guilt from the Nazi era is too deep-seated, but ironically, it is precisely with this, again, mistaken sense of tolerance we contribute yet again to a new form of fascism, and this time worldwide. In 1993, Emma published the first dossier on the consequences of the agitation by Islamist fanatics. 1993, 13 years before we met and befriended Ayaan. The title of that publication was Mitten unter uns, in our midst. Already then, one could have known if only one had wanted to. The left played a fatal role in this. The advocates of proxy politics had lost the proletariat, and they were looking for new victims in whose name they could act, and they discovered the Muslims. But Ayaan Hirsi Ali did not want to be their victim. She set about thinking and acting for herself. She went into politics, and she knew then and knows now what she is talking about. After all, Muslims, above all Muslim women, are the first victims of orthodoxy and fundamentalism. These typically male associations, for them the subjugation of women is central. Indeed, it is their constituent moment. Their flag is the headscarf, as it has been for 43 years in Iran. The gap between women and men is the first and foremost drastic reenactment of an us and a you. You, as in the others, the lesser ones. We, as the united ones who make the law in the name of their just cause. The emancipation of Muslims, and above all Muslim women, is therefore key to modernizing Islam. A first step would be an end to the separation of the sexes, which already begins at a very young age and ends with this mistaken tolerance of the headscarf, which severely impairs and stigmatizes women. Which is why all women wearing headscarves in the West, Muslim women as well as converts, must now take off the headscarf, also with a view as to what is happening in Iran today, out of solidarity. Also those that are wearing it voluntarily, out of solidarity with those women that do not have the freedom to take it off. Ayaan Hirsi Ali now researches and teaches in the United States, which means that she now has to deal with gender feminism and trans ideology. After all, both come from the United States. We briefly exchanged ideas, and we have been fighting the same battles, and Ayaan said, this problem, this issue with trans ideology is currently even worse than the problem with Islamism. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a universalist feminist. For her, all people are equal. She, however, does not deny reality. She protests against the fact that trans ideologists, who very often are not transsexual themselves, but practice proxy politics, deny the reality of biological gender and the social reality of women. The fact that there are only two biological sexes is based in science, that it is not a question of sensitivities. It's a fact. And as a consequence of the female gender, there is the reality of the gender pay gap. There is gender medicine and femicides, things that affect women because they are biologically women. There are, of course, many gender roles. There's nothing new to that. This is something that we started even. We need to admit to that. Those roles, however, need to be abolished. That's how we see it. But that does not mean that the biological gender has to be done away with. Let's get out of our identity closet. Let's embrace humanity, regardless of whether it presents itself as female or male. Like all of us, universalist feminists like Rowling, or myself, or Hirsi Ali, find it only natural that people with genuine gender dysphoria, whose pain is often great, should be helped. That laws be created under which they can change their gender identity without humiliation. They are, however, a vanishing minority. 0.002% was 20 years ago, and today it's perhaps 3 times as many. The majority of young people who consider themselves trans today have fallen into a maelstrom of gender roles while simply experiencing gender trouble in puberty. They are mainly girls, 10 times as many girls as boys, who today maintain they are trans. But what they experience is a crisis in puberty. They have, as I said, fallen into the maelstrom of gender roles, and they're girls, as I said, whose number has increased 40-fold in recent years in the Western world. They don't want to be women, and who could understand better than a feminist? And Ayaan probably at one point of time would not have wanted to be a woman too in her country of origin, because it can cost your life. But that does not mean that these girls in the West have to take puberty blockers or hormones that are physically and psychologically harmful, nor do they have to have their breasts amputated or their genitalia mutilated. They do not have to become a man for that. They can be free women. Very simply, as Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Ayaan, you come from a culture where it can still cost your life to be a biological woman. And nobody can tell anyone there that you feel different today. And yet you are a free human being, out of your own free will, out of your strength, out of your courage. And I congratulate you warmly on your life and on the award of this prize.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Alice, thank you very, very much. I walked in this evening. I was standing here and I saw Alice and I got so excited. And I remember, yes, 2006. I remember 2005. I remember that when I was in big, bad trouble, that Alice, it was you and individuals like you, a very small group of individuals in Europe, who supported me openly, regardless of the Islamist threats, regardless of the what I didn't understand. I don't know what label we gave it, radical leftist rejection of my acceptance of universal European human rights. So I am forever grateful to you, and I think it is you really who deserves all the honor in the world and all the appreciation and all the awards for your persistence from the time of Simone de Beauvoir, from the time of Iran, up to now. You have never changed. You're still the same woman. You still fight for the same rights, and you inspire women like me and girls. And I hope you live forever, and that your work lives forever. So thank you. I want also to thank the Frank Schirrmacher Stiftung. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I want to congratulate Dr. Serhiy Zhadan on his Freedom Award and express my sympathy and my admiration for the people of Poland, the people of Ukraine, for the kind of fighting spirit that they have shown. And I think you deserve all the recognition in the world. Well, unlike many of you here, I sadly didn't have a chance to meet Mr. Frank Schirrmacher. The only way for me to intellectually engage with him is by familiarizing myself with his work and his thought-provoking, gripping, and incredibly far-sighted books and articles. And now I'm looking at the challenges that face us here in Europe and the world, and I can only imagine what great passion and determination Mr. Schirrmacher would have to stand up to the voices of discord. He was a defender of the open society through the written word, but also through civic engagement. In his book, Wake Up Call for Europe Tech, Mr. Schirrmacher argued that, and I quote, Europe should be more than just a source for the software ego crisis, loss of identity, despair, and Western melancholy. He said we should be helping write the code for tomorrow. Now, looking at the daunting challenges we face, it's hard to believe that these words were written 22 years ago in the year 2000. I take Wake Up Call for Europe Tech as a prophecy of the grim future of Western civilization. That is, if we fail to resist the looming threats to free speech, to human rights, and to our history and culture. I came to Europe in 1992. I was only 22 years old, and I came from the world that Alice just described. And back then, what I found here was optimism. The Soviet Union was defeated, the Berlin Wall had come down, radical Islam was not a major subject of Western debate, and China was still, relatively speaking, unremarkable. Western leaders, and in particular the leaders of Europe, were confident that the world would come to embrace freedom, equality, tolerance, pluralism, the free market, and the rule of law. They intended to promote these ideals and values through soft power, trade, diplomacy, development aid, and collaboration. I think it was a mistake back then to have completely discarded the concept of hard power, because we forgot that there is always evil, and that the only way to defeat evil, as Ukraine is experiencing today, is through hard power. 30 years later, and here we are, back to the gloomy days of the Cold War. Vladimir Putin's senseless war on Ukraine has got us talking more and more about the possibility of nuclear confrontation with him. China's economic rise and its prosperity has not led to peace, but it has led to the opposite. Xi Jinping is now a dictator like Mao. There is serious talk of his intention to invade Taiwan. Our Western economies are so enmeshed with those of China and Russia that we have no clue how to stop these authoritarian leaders without shooting ourselves in the foot. In many European countries, the failure to get a grip on immigration and radical Islam is causing voters to turn to the far right and populist parties. Islamism is entrenched in countries like France and Sweden to the point that commentators in those two countries talk not only about terrorist attacks, but outright civil war. The emancipation of women and of gays is challenged by Islamism, and it's on a backward slide in Europe. In America, we're absorbed by culture wars and narratives pitting groups of people against one another along lines of race, gender, sexual orientation, and class. Inflation is making these matters worse, and our cities are shaken by violent crime and mass shootings. It seems as if Frank Schirrmacher's prophecy of our loss of identity is coming to pass. Technological advances have led to regression and confusion. We're falling back towards tribalism, and social media has given us an unmooring of our youth. I accept this award tonight, and I'm honored, and I'm humbled, and I'm grateful. The only way I can honor Mr. Schirrmacher's memory is to remain hopeful, is to remain an optimist. It's to fight for what is right. It's to oppose what is wrong. It's to express courage and to commit to safeguarding our societies for future generations. Thank you. Thank you for gracing me with the Schirrmacher Award. And Dr. Meyer, I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayaan, for this tense and impressive speech. The Austrian philosopher Karl Popper wrote a famous book with the title The Open Society and Its Enemies, and he saw it as a reflection on totalitarianism from the right and on the left, and warned against this kind of illiberalism, and also tried to persuade us to defend our Western values. If we hear you, and I think we all agree on your analysis, it is really gloomy. The situation is gloomy, has never been so gloomy in the last 20, 30 years. We had the optimism after 1989 that everything would be better and better. And Francis Fukuyama, of course, wrote his famous book, The End of History. History is back in a most dramatic way, and we don't really know how to cope with it, especially also we citizens of Western countries and of Europe. Where do you perceive the foremost dangers of the current state of affairs in the world?
I think that the biggest challenge we have in Europe is our own complacency. It is this attitude that, I'm too comfortable with my own life and I'm going to let someone else do the fighting. For a long time, I think in Europe, we got too used to the idea America, Uncle Sam is going to do the heavy lifting when it comes to the issue of hard power. And so we were not giving enough money to NATO. We were not building our militaries. We were not paying enough attention to evil men like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. I think we were too arrogant in Europe. We thought that we could talk these men out of their ideas of supremacy. We were too absorbed in trying to prevent our own supremacy, white supremacy, which, to be frank with you, it's still there, but it has largely been defeated. White supremacists do not control states, they do not control militaries, they do not control economies, they do not control narratives. To me, white supremacists today are a bunch of losers. But if you were to read our books, our novels, listen to our politicians, you would think that that would be the prevailing evil of our times. We're only talking about decolonization and slavery and all this completely navel-gazing and by default then ignoring the real problems that we face. And so I would say the biggest danger for me is how can I persuade you to get out of that mindset and to pay attention to the real threats that we face and stand up to them. And by standing, I mean really stand together to stand up to them.
Absolutely. You mentioned the nice notion or not so nice notion of the bunch of losers. Indeed, we can observe that at many places and in many countries. But the question is always, what kind of wake-up call could finally work out that we perceive it differently and act differently, especially in Europe?
Well, let's have grown-up conversations about energy, number one. We have a lot of conversations about global warming and climate change. And I think in the last 30, 40 years in Europe, we have done quite a huge investment in trying to come to terms with that. Wealthy European countries and even America, if you look at our climate policies, they're superior to the climate policies of China, of India, of Russia, of elsewhere. So let's appreciate what we have achieved. Let's also get to a place of consensus where we don't have to depend on our energy to these other powers. And I think that's a question of leadership. I pick energy right now because I think, how can we turn this thing around? How can we stop Putin? And all you have to do is look at the energy politics of a country like Germany. And with that kind of dependence on an evil power, I think it becomes almost impossible. So that's priority number one. And then the other priorities, it is, we sometimes I think in Europe and in the EU countries, we pretend as if we have a common cause, but actually under the surface, we're constantly competing and constantly going against each other. And if we said, let's unite, then let's really mean that and appreciate every country's interests and see how we can resolve those things. We have a huge problem with demographics. Our societies are aging. We're not having enough children. So what kind of policies can we have to encourage our populations to have more children? Let's have an honest debate on immigration, integration, and radical Islam. We've pretty much shut that down in many countries. So we have huge problems. We pretend to be the continent that is adept at leading conversations, but we actually are not having conversations right now. We have silos, we have factions, and I live in America, which is supposed to be our Western leader, and the crisis of polarization is dramatic.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost everywhere and makes one really desperate. You mentioned leadership, which is, of course, a huge problem too. Politicians who can stand for leadership, who can transmit their ideas, persuade people to vote for that. And what is also interesting, we often talk about the we should do.
Yeah.
But if we look at Europe, and you already mentioned it, who is this we? It's not a political we, it's maybe a moral we, it's maybe an emotional we, and it's very comforting when we sit together with a good glass of wine and say, okay, ladies and gentlemen, we really have to do that, and so certainly. But if it goes to reality, who could be this we to transform the world or only Europe in a better way? There's a void, if you look at Europe. Do you agree with this analysis?
I agree with this analysis to the point where I say there is an avoidance of issues that we have declared too sensitive, too polarizing. But there is a moral we. And someone like me from the outside, I can point to the reality that almost the entire continent of Africa wants to move to Europe or to America. Almost the entire continent of the Middle East, South Asia, they all want to come here.
Somehow understandably so, no?
Understandably so. And so I think in that sense, then you could pose the question, if Western society is so evil, if it is full of white supremacy and colonization and all these terrible things, why is it then that all these people outside of the West, why do they all want to come here? Why can we not stand together in saying, we're really proud of what we've achieved. We're really proud of the way we treat our women, the laws we have put in place, the free market, the rule of law, pluralism, all the things that we have achieved, and to understand now that these things are under threat. But what do we have in our universities? What do we have in our governments? What do we have in our schools? We have what Alice is talking about, where we're fighting about the most basic reality of all. How do you define a woman? This is some of the fights that we're having. So we're completely lost in these trivialities. And the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and people are looking to us for leadership. Young people are looking to us for leadership. Immigrants are looking to us for leadership. Other parts of the world are looking to us for leadership, and we're not giving that leadership.
That's a pity, absolutely. You are a strong personality to promote that, but we need more women like you.
I think we need everybody. I think we need financial backing. I think we need moral backing. I think we need institutional backing. I think at some point we are being driven to a place where we have to make a choice. Either we survive together, or these other forces come from outside and they fragment us, and or from the inside. If you look at what we're calling wokeism, these people who are refusing to define what a woman is, and who are trying to divide us into races and sexual orientation and just fragment society into these immutable characteristics, I think they're winning because they're being indulged at every level. They're being indulged by the corporations, they're being indulged by the leadership. The opposition leader of the United Kingdom, the Labour Party, is asked on the media, can you define what a woman is? He wouldn't do it. A Supreme Court justice who is chosen by the president to come to, she's nominated, she's asked on television, or in the Senate, can you define what is a woman? She says, I don't know, we need to call an expert.
Oh, she's scared of doing it.
But that is exactly it.
Yes.
We've created environments where intelligent people are scared to speak the most basic truth. And so if we go down this rabbit hole, while very serious things are happening, then I think it is going to be very difficult to sell the brand that is Western society.
You already mentioned the United States, where the fights get stronger and stronger, and the divisions, which is also scary because the United States are still the protector for freedom, also for Europe, of course. And what's your perception? What's your how do you foresee what could happen actually in America in the next couple of months, also with the elections now?
So, if you look at it optimistically, you will say there is going to be an election because that's the way democracies operate, and the party in government that's messing up is going to be punished, and the party that wins should have then learned from the mistakes of the other side, and we start having serious discussions about serious problems. But when I'm pessimistic, I think of what I was told in 2006 when I went to the United States of America, and I was told there are two parties in America. There's the party of power, the Democratic Party, and the party of stupid. And the party of stupid is the Republican Party, and you can trust them to mess it up. So if you look at it from a pessimistic lens, you could say the Republicans will probably win this midterm. They probably will win 2024, but they're going to mess it up somehow.
Do you think it is a real possibility that America could face a civil war?
I don't know. Some people say that. If you go look back at the history of America, you see that the way they speak now, the way leaders speak now, that is always how they used to speak. We know of some of the cliche expressions that Americans don't rise to the occasion until every last possibility has been tried, and they try every bad idea, and then that is when they come. But I think that this time there is a sense that things are different.
They're different, definitely.
They're different because China's military is something to reckon with. And ours, every time we do war gaming right now in the United States, they say it looks like we're the ones who are losing. I think what's going on between Vladimir Putin and NATO and the way we've let down Ukraine, that we're approaching a situation where he is threatening to use nuclear weapons.
Are you scared that it really could come to the worst there? Could it come to the worst, actually?
It could. I mean, he is cornered. He has to go back to his people and explain why he invaded Ukraine, what his objectives were, and what the definition is to win a war. The Ukrainians they've demonstrated this incredible courage, and they fought back in this resilience. So you can't ask them to give up land. You can't ask them to give up what they've been fighting for.
Yeah.
So you're now going to have the kind of, and he's losing. Putin is losing this war.
It's a total failure till now.
He's a complete failure, complete and utter failure. However, whichever direction you look at it from, and I don't know about his sanity, and I don't know about the people around him, but you hear that more and more serious people who know about this situation are talking about nuclear weapons the way we used to talk about nuclear weapons back in the day when President Kennedy was president.
Absolutely. The Cuban Missile Crisis is also interesting. We have plenty of so-called security experts, and what they foresaw was pretty poor. The last 15 or 20 years, we are totally not prepared to what Putin finally did, first with Crimea and then now. You mentioned also Iran. There is maybe a potential for revolution because it never had this strong movement till now, especially also from completely different places all over Iran, not only Tehran, but also little cities, smaller cities, upheavals and fights with the police and the revolution guards. Is there a potential there, or what actually would cause a regime change against this horrible dictatorship of the mullahs?
I think the protests we are seeing now have the potency to bring the regime down. The regime is obviously suffering from the sanctions. I think it's probably good news that America is no longer invested in these so-called JC power negotiations, where the Iranian regime was getting a lot of money, and that money was being used for repression at home and the promotion of terrorism abroad. But here's the dilemma. Let's say the regime falls today, then the question is what comes next?
Exactly.
Is that going to be a Marxist regime? Is it going to be a liberal democracy?
Or the
military? Is it going to be an anarchy? Is the military going to take over? What is going to happen next?
Yeah.
And that's a big question mark at the moment. And I think what's been happening in the past, for instance, in 2009, when the Green Movement was active in Iran, that Western countries, and in particular the United States, they didn't quite know what would come next, so they just let the regime stay. And I think Iran is a very interesting people. I think we have the opportunity that the population is secular, the population is westernized, they want an economy that's running well for them. These are very young people who feel as if their lives are wasted. What I find remarkable, Elise, is that the women of Iran are able to burn their headscarves because they have support from the men of Iran. They have their fathers and their husbands and their boyfriends and their cousins and their relatives, the men, supporting them so that they can do that. That's remarkable in the Middle East. I don't think there's any other country in the Middle East where that's happening. So we have a lot to build on. But that is now where I would say I would organize some form of diplomacy and say maybe we can suggest a package in the event that the regime falls, where we can say this is how we can help the Iranians govern themselves post the Islamist regime.
We definitely have to support that, and it could end, hopefully, the best case solution. But it's a grim fight, definitely, and they will take all the power they have to suppress the people who seek for freedom and human rights. We already are in the topic of Islam and Islamism. How do you see the relationship between Islam and Islamism? Mm-hmm. And can Islam, as a religion, which is more than a religion, is kind of also a concept of life. It's not only a religion. Can it ever get reformed in the sense of, say, an European enlightenment? Is this possible? Or does it take another 500 years?
I think on a theological level, the Islamists will fragment. And I have some good news for you. And the good news is that a country like Saudi Arabia has decided to move away from Islamism. Islamists, the Wahhabis, the Salafis, the Muslim Brotherhood, they used to get a lot of money and legitimation, not just money, legitimacy from the Saudi government. And the Saudi government has now decided to move on to experimenting with something else, trying to integrate her economy into the economy of the rest of the world. That I read some empirical science like the virtue and the vice police being set aside, the Wahhabis being demoted, cultural and Western entertainment being invited into the country, Saudi women being told they don't need to have the male guardian. In reality, that doesn't mean much, but at least on a formal perspective, they don't have to have the male guardian. So I think that is a huge success. The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians are having friendly talks with the state of Israel. That's revolutionary. So there are a few good things, very, very good developments that are taking place.
Turkey?
I don't like Erdogan. I will tell you that. I don't trust the Qataris. That is also a fact. Indonesia, which is the country with the largest number of Muslims, is the Islamism there is bottom up.
Absolutely.
And the government of Indonesia depends on the organizational skills of the Islamists to win elections. So that relationship is not a good one. It's a plus for Islamists. And I think for Islamism, the biggest story is it's in Europe and the West where they are most empowered. The Islamists of Europe now are the wealthiest, the best organized, and they actually are exporting. Middle Easterners have rejected Islamism since the defeat of ISIS, but Islamism is now being exported from the West to the Middle East, incredibly. So in that sense, I think there is a lot of work to be done. But if you say 500 years from now, do you think Islam will be reformed to the point of Christianity? I will say yes, through the road of fragmentation. And even I can even see fragmentation not just with Islam in general, but with Islamism itself.
Right. Maybe a last question here in this round. It's a very interesting discussion. And we didn't mention also the problem of parallel societies. In Germany, for instance, very strong. France, for 40 or more years, never solved. England too. And the politicians somehow make a detour about that. They don't want to face it, as it gets often in certain quarters mentioned Berlin worse and worse. Police does not dare to enter these places. Anyway, what is your most important advice for young people to stay optimistic in these gloomy times and defend Western values?
I think take the bull by the horns. That is really the way to do it, and stop avoiding very serious topics. The more you avoid, the more entrenched the problems get, the more divided society gets. So I think the most important thing that the French can do, and the Swedes and the Germans, the Dutch, I'm not quite sure about the situation in Switzerland, it is to try and develop programs of assimilation so that these parallel societies are slowly phased out. What we are seeing now in Europe, and it should worry you, is that you have criminal syndicates along ethnic lines. The police cannot infiltrate them because you are having, members of the criminal syndicates are brothers and cousins and other relatives. They speak the same language. It becomes extremely difficult to look into these things. Sometimes it's along religious lines. And you have parallel society on every level, and you have an underclass in Europe that is going to get bigger and bigger. Because just think about the number of people only in the continent of Africa, which is a poor continent. We have economic downturns coming along. And so you are going to have more and more people come in from Africa, from South Asia, even from different parts of Europe. And the more that carries on with no assimilation in sight, then there is a real risk that some parts of Europe are going to look like some parts of Africa. In fact, there are parts of Sweden, like Malmo, where you say the lawlessness, it's just as lawless as parts of Africa.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So instead of the developing world becoming developed, you're going to see the developed world looking like the developing world. And that's bleak.
Hans Magnus Enzensberger decades ago wrote an essay, Die große Wanderung, the great, how you call that, way to walk through. And he already anticipated many of those problems. And of course, when the book appeared, people said, oh my God, this is apocalyptic. And actually it's not. I only can recommend you to read this essay again and be scared about how it fits to the actual situation. But now, so what your children, what do you suggest to them to be optimistic and have a great life and be self-confident? And it's of course it's bad, but it will be better as a mother.
Well, I think the values of Europe Western values, regardless of where you try them, they're superior and they're abiding. So the respect for the inviolability of the rights of the individual, regardless of where you try it, it's superior. The free markets, the rule of law, the emancipation of women, the emancipation of gay people, all of that, regardless of where you try it, this always wins. South Korea is doing well because they've applied that. Taiwan is doing that because they have applied that to a certain degree. Japan is doing well because they're doing that to a certain degree. So everywhere in the world, regardless of where it is, where you apply these principles in a serious way and you establish institutions where these principles are enforced, places look good. So I think our unique selling point is our values. And there's where I see the optimism, even after a crisis, that you try and sell to the other side. See, we are wealthy in Europe. Switzerland is Switzerland because these are the principles she applies.
Yeah. It needed some time.
Look at Israel, Look at Israel and her neighboring countries. And the neighboring countries are now maybe saying, maybe it's better, instead of trying to destroy Israel, maybe it's better to copy them and to learn from them. So I think we have something to sell, we're just not doing it. And that's dumb.
And you cultivate a family with positive thinking, also along your side of your husband, Neil Ferguson, of course.
Yes. But now the United States State Department, that's the Foreign Office, is taking taxpayer money and it's selling the idea of transgenderism to Indonesia, to Ecuador, to everywhere. And all of these people are looking at them and they think, well, America has gone completely mad. And I don't blame them.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much, Ayaan, for this conversation. Give Ayaan a huge hand.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And I pass the word over to Anna Prizkau.
Okay. Thank you.
Good evening. The world is bad. It has always been, and sometimes even dark and jet black. It is again since February. Which leads me to the question, what is an artist to do in this world, with this world? Max Frisch said that some writers wrote in order to change the world and some to endure the world, which in turn leads to the second question. What kind of a writer is the writer Serhiy Zhadan? The answer is in Depeche Mode. This novel, his first novel, is a Bible. It is a Bible for people who believe in art, not in God. But perhaps also for people who believe in God, because what Zhadan does there and how it is overpowering. Depeche Mode is about young women and young men who, as Zhadan writes, plunge into the pitted and patched circuit of blood and love, at the bottom of which are supposed to be the most massive and wonderful pieces of happiness, although in reality there is nothing there. You can believe me. It is about dog Pavlov, permanently unemployed and permanently drunk. His parents are Jews, but he does not refer that to himself because dog likes to be a right-winger. It is about Maruzia, general's daughter, perhaps sex addict, certainly very filthy and beautiful, who sometimes presses the bust of Molotov tenderly against her body. The book is about Vasya, communist. He makes a lot of money by buying vodka cheaply and selling it at the train station at a much higher price to drunkards. So it's about young people whose hearts are drained and empty from alcohol, drugs, and life. But not completely, because, and you see this in all of Zhadan's novels, in his stories, in his poems, no matter how sick, broken, raw his heroes are, they're always truthful, they're always true, they're always real. This is because this poet, this writer describes people as people are, how they hurt each other, how they are hurt, how they suffer from evil and still do evil. That's why his heroes are never just figures of ink on paper. Serhiy Zhadan constantly puts deviant and good, bad heroes into his literature and exhibits the truth with them, nothing less. Which brings us back to Max Frisch's "Why We Write" sentence, and perhaps also to the answer of the question why someone like Zhadan writes. Because if a poet only wanted to endure this world, he would not tell of the most unbearable, and not as brutally as Serhiy Zhadan does in his novels, with such force, as if to push his readers from the edge of a skyscraper, as in the dream shared by all of us, perhaps, in which one falls and falls and falls, screaming, with terror in one's eyes and arms flailing. In Depeche Mode, in that fall, for example, the communist past passes you by, which made the novels Broken Children, the broken children they are, followed by this capitalistic present of the 90s. In Falling, though, you always feel something very universal. You feel morality. That first reveals the writer's great compassion for the weak, for the weakest. And it also reveals the brutality with which Serhiy Zhadan makes the unfortunate feel their misfortune, in a language that is sometimes as rough as that of Henry Miller or Charles Bukowski, in a language that is sometimes as poetic as that of Carson McCullers or Totev Ditlevson, in a completely new language. His morality, his brutality and language, they are the fingerprint of his literature. You can see it in every book of Serhiy Zhadan. You see it sharply in Boarding School, for example, his first war novel, in the melancholic, bestial, lovely Kharkiv book, Mesopotamia. Or you see it in The Invention of Jazz in the Donbass, which is a struggle between the misery of the oligarchy and that of the miserable poor. Throughout his work, Serhiy Zhadan shows his readers good and evil struggling with each other, and through his soft, hard sentences makes the readers feel, smell, taste the struggle itself and lets them hope. Humanism, that is the core of Serhiy Zhadan's poetry, and, in addition, this passionate desire for the world's stench and hurt to finally stop. That is why there's always a glimmer of something warm and rare in his books, a glimmer of happiness. To be sure, it never lasts longer than a moment, but its radiance is as strong and fierce that everyone reading his novels, his stories, poems, wishes to lead just as drunken, sick-broken, hard life as Zhadan's protagonists have to lead. Because, exciting though you find the hopelessness in his literature, you firmly wish for things to get better. Not only for all the real, fake Zhadan heroes, but especially for yourself as a reader. Which also answers the question about the world and about Max Frisch, because Serhiy Zhadan is a writer who wants to change this world and not just endure it. He will perhaps never say that about himself, nor did Max Frisch. Thus, in his literature, the world changer, Serhiy Zhadan, stands up for the hard, miserable and bad life, which one day may become half as hard and bad and miserable as it is right now, but he also stands up for it in reality, in the present and in Ukraine, because he stayed there, in the destroyed and embattled city of Kharkiv. Why? Because there's a lot of work. Zhadan wrote on Facebook. Because this poet works day after day not only as a poet. He collects money, he buys cars for the Ukrainian armed forces, drones, cell phones, sings, he plays concerts, he reads for the people who have to live in war. Probably because he knows that words and art can help people, and yes, they do. When Zhadan writes about this war now, and he does so every day online, he does not write about it harshly or poetically. He does not write about it as he does in his books. In March, for example, he wrote this: A lot will be said and sung about this war, as I assume in a completely different language. In the language that is emerging right now, every day, across the country. For now, it contains too much pain, but also enough anger, and most importantly, enough faith and love. How this new language grows can be seen in Sky over Kharkiv, which is his online recordings now published as a book. In a postscript he writes, "Now it's not about literature, it's about reality itself." But Serhiy Zhadan is mistaken. His literature is precisely about that. It is about reality and, yes, about truth. And that is why today I do not congratulate the world changer Serhiy Zhadan. I congratulate us, who may, will, and do read the writer Serhiy Zhadan. Thank you very much, Anna Prizkau, for this beautiful and for this very bright laudation. You mentioned Max Frisch, and I thought the young Albert Camus could probably also be close to such an aesthetic and political commitment. We have about 7 minutes. Perhaps we could briefly talk together. When did you first encounter Serhiy as a reader? And when did you meet him first? As a reader, perhaps 10 years ago, and as a person 9 years ago. What was that like? It was always in Ukraine, by the way. It was exciting. There's not so many clever things I can say about that, because he was touring with his band, Slovakia, the Dogs. There was a lot of drinking, there was a lot of dancing, a lot of singing. And there were different songs from those that they play now. Then it was about 300 Chinese, now it's about children who need to stay alive. You mentioned the band. If you've never seen it hearted, what is it like? Is it heavy metal? How would you term it? I think he would say it's rock and roll, but it's very visceral. There's trumpets as well. Many ensemble members are actually classical musicians who, at the onset of the new war, we don't have a name for that war yet, since February 24th. But obviously, the war started back in 2014, but they had a position as classical musicians. They could not work anymore since then. Obviously, he has many talents. He is a novelist, he writes poetry, he writes music, he's a composer, a performer, and he is a very political person, and now also someone who has assumed various functions fighting in this war. In all confidence, you shared with me that in the foreseeable future you would like to travel back to Ukraine, where you will certainly meet up with him and others. What do you expect when you get back to Ukraine? Do you have certain ideas, fears perhaps? I'm probably more afraid now than on my last visit since February 24th. I actually went to Ukraine twice after February 24th. I'm not afraid of the power disruptions that you see everywhere, because you can heat the apartment with wood, as my friend told me in Kiev. But now rockets are attacking the center of Kiev. As it is as if they were attacking Friedrichstraße in Berlin. I don't know the names of streets in Zurich, but it's horrifying. What about Kharkiv? What does Kharkiv look like? I think it was worse in Kharkiv at one point of time than it is now, but I don't know specifically what the situation in Kharkiv is, but I think it's not as dire as it was in March and April. When he was nominated for the Friedenspreis des Buchhandels, I was at a physician's office. I got 5 or 6 calls from my office. My newspaper wanted me to write about Zhadan, and I was full of panic because I called him the Sunday before, and he told me a rocket had hit the adjacent house. I did not know about the Friedenspreis that he was awarded, and I was so worried because I thought it was about him. I thought the worst had happened to him. And it was only then that I saw that it was about the Friedenspreis. And I can also add that he had been awarded the Frank Schirrmacher Freedom Prize. We were the first ones. And we can say so with pride. It was only afterwards that he got the Friedenspreis. Next up is the Nobel Prize, of course. We have a video from Serhiy that we want to show you. It's a recording where he briefly spoke about being awarded this prize. If I could have that, please, on screen. Dear friends, I would like to thank you very much for this award. For me personally, its importance is highlighted by the not exactly reassuring, indeed the simply dramatic circumstances in which we are gathered today. There is a war going on in Europe. It's a bloody and a cynical war, an unjust war that lacks any justification. Russia is destroying Ukrainian towns. Russia is killing Ukrainian women, children and men. Since the end of February, the war has taken on new dimensions. For 9 months now, we have been living in maximum abnormality. We've been living in a split reality, when the only reality for all of us that dominates our thoughts, feelings and hopes is the reality of approaching death, great pain and irreversible loss. The reality of war is pulling the solid ground from under our feet. It throws us off balance. It changes the weight of fundamental things, principles and ideas about the world. When we face evil, violence and uncontrolled aggression, we are first forced to defend ourselves, to worry about our survival, simply to stay alive. In these circumstances, we talk about freedom. Talking about freedom as a value that connects us to our pre-war past is a source of strength in the midst of the bloody present, and it shapes the vision of our future. The need for freedom, given its obviousness and undeniability, is perhaps the motivation that gives us strength even in the darkest of times and in the midst of the most hopeless circumstances. So let us talk about freedom. What can I say about freedom today when literally thousands of my compatriots have become prisoners or hostages of the aggressor? I can tell the story of my old acquaintance, my school friend. We lived on the same street and went to the same class. We hardly saw each other after school. Each lived his own life. Some memories remained. The past connected us, but not tightly enough to look for any reason for further communication. When, in 2014, war broke out, he joined the army. He volunteered. He drove a truck. Later, he retired from the military. Last spring, his town came under Russian occupation. He was arrested by the Russians and sentenced to 12 years in prison as a participant in the anti-terrorist operation, that is, as a former Ukrainian soldier. I often remember him. Firstly, I am concerned about his fate, and secondly, I think about how a person feels who gets 12 years of imprisonment in his own country for defending that country against the invaders. What does he think of freedom in general? How can he define its absence? Why is it so difficult to talk about freedom? Why do conversations about it vacillate between exaggerated pathos and the repetition of self-evident facts that cannot always explain everything? Perhaps because our understanding of freedom and its natural presence are both so familiar and abstract that it is difficult to find words for its definition that do not sound like a quote. Still, we need to talk about freedom, if only because our freedom is the first victim of any attack. It is freedom of which the aggressor deprives us. It is the most important and essential value for which Ukrainians are fighting today. And indeed, we are not defending specific territories, nor one or the other settlement. No, we are defending our freedom, because we acutely feel how it is threatened. And the Ukrainians who have found themselves in the Russian-occupied territories, Ukrainians who have found themselves in the Russian prisons or concentration camps, what do they feel when they hear the word freedom? For them, it is suddenly no longer an abstracted general term. For them, freedom takes on a special weight and meaning, for it is only through freedom that all the basic concepts and definitions, such as dignity, mutual respect, and mutual trust, take on meaning. Only when you lose the possibility of free expression do you realize the importance of language. It is only when one sits in a prison cell that one realizes the vital necessity of freedom of movement. Freedom usually makes itself felt when it has been forcibly taken from one. Its value increases as soon as it is lacking. A person's right to freedom suddenly becomes especially manifest when there is boundless violence and lawlessness. That is, our discussion of freedom lose their abstract and illusory character precisely where reality breaks down, where bleeding and painful gaps appear between our representations of the world and the cruel reality in which our conceptions are simply disregarded or brutally negated. That is, in one way or another, we tend to talk about freedom in the context of its necessity, its absence, its deformity. Something similar is happening in our time as well. That is why this conversation seems to be especially important today. What else is important? Now, for me, the concept of freedom, an individual and a collective one, is always closely linked to the concept of responsibility. Freedom is a generous gift that demands daily work from us, from our hearts, and from our conscience. For the absence of responsibility for the fundamental rights and freedoms to which we are entitled by birth levels the very concept of justice, its idea, and its self-evidence. After all, freedom is always about the freedom of others. This understanding of a common space and common rules for all seems to me to be particularly important. It is just as important to talk about the things which we all need so much now. The values that hold us together become especially visible in times of war, demanding our personal commitment, our strength, our faith, and our patience. I think today's meeting is a good opportunity to remind ourselves that in dark and sad times it is especially important to help those who are deprived of the most basic things, who are defenseless, whose rights and opportunities are restricted and ignored. This realization is simple, and yet we sometimes forget these simple things amidst talk of geopolitics, economic pragmatism, and historical causes. It seems important and necessary not to forget the inevitability of freedom. I understand that it is difficult to make new, original arguments in favor of freedom, but let us be honest, we will hardly find counter-arguments either. The need for freedom is undeniable. Its necessity is obvious. And it is our common duty to protect it. When we understand this, it is much easier for us to hold on to our convictions and not to fall into despair and powerlessness. We need to be strong in order to remain open and responsible. After all, openness is a great freedom. Let us not lose it. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I think what we heard testifies impressively to Serhiy's commitment to freedom in very, very difficult times indeed, in times of existential threats which his country faces and which must be countered with all means. And I remembered something that was very intense for me. He said, freedom is a gift that takes honest work from us, that demands honest work from us. And with that, I close our event today. I thank again everyone involved. I thank everyone on the panel, and I thank you, ladies and gentlemen, who have followed this event, who have made this prize possible. Having awarded 2 prizes to Ayaan and Serhiy, we have indeed hit a nerve today, which is what we wanted to do, but we have also succeeded in awarding 2 exemplary personalities who are more than deserving. And of course, we very much hope that we meet them again and have them back at the Swiss Institute for Foreign Research. I wish you all good evening. Thank you very much. You can still follow this live stream later if you wish to do so. Thank you.